Hi everyone, I'm Katie Stanley and I'm an assistant naturalist here at the Latodami Nature Center. At the Latodami Nature Center, we like to do a Thursday hike every Thursday, and we've been doing it for 50 years, but unfortunately we have canceled our Thursday hikes. But we didn't want to forget about them completely. We wanted to bring you along on a virtual hike with us on this Thursday. So we're going to be visiting our nature access trail, which we like to refer to as the Braille Trail. We call it this because it was originally designed for sight-impaired people. So it did at one time feature Braille, and you can still see some of the guiding line that goes along the entirety of the trail. So this trail is awesome because it's a short half-mile loop that features many different habitats, and it has some awesome QR codes and environmental education signs along the way. So if you have some free time, which a lot of us have right now, you could just come on out here and take a short hike. But if you want to join me, come along, and today we'll learn about some really cool stuff that we see along this trail. All right, so one of the first things that I want to point out on this trail is poison ivy, all of our favorite plants. So you could see the poison ivy crawling up this tree right here, and poison ivy is very distinctive because of its vine that has hair, like hair structures all along it. So if you see this along a tree, do not touch it. That is very indicative of poison ivy. So although we as humans hate poison ivy, we're actually the only creatures on the planet that can get a rash from it. It has a chemical called urushiol, and that chemical actually is very potent. All you need is the tip of a pinhead to be covered, and 500 people can be infected with poison ivy rash. So it's not very pleasant for humans, but it actually is a very important plant for animals. It produces beautiful white berries that are a great food source, and it is a native plant to Pennsylvania. So although we may find it as a nuisance, it's totally great in our environment, and it does not harm trees that it grows on at all. So if you're lucky enough to come hiking on a muddy day like today, you might come across something like this. Here we have a deer footprint. So looking for tracks is something that's really fun and can be awesome to teach your kids, but deer tracks are very obvious and they're fun because you can actually tell which way a deer was going by looking at their footprints. So the cool thing about deer footprints is that they are kind of like an arrow. So I have these two sticks right here, and if I line them up on both sides of the arrow, they'll point in which direction the deer was going. So we could see that this guy was walking up the Braille Trail. He was enjoying it today too. So this next plant is something that's really cool because it inspired the invention of Velcro. The plant I'm talking about is right here. It's called Burdock. Right now it's not very colorful, but come spring and summer it'll have a little bit more to it. But right now it's awesome because you could see its dispersal mechanism. So the way that this plant disperses its seeds is by sticking to you. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this glove on, and if I just brush on past it, I immediately grab two of these guys, and you could see that no matter what I try to do to it, it sticks on and it actually dispenses its seeds. And the reason that it's able to do that is because of these tiny little hooks that are on the end of the bristles. So a Swiss engineer one day was hiking with his dog, and he decided to just walk through some brush, and all of a sudden he noticed these things sticking all over him. And he noticed that no matter what he did to try to get them off of himself or his dog's fur, they just stayed right on. So he decided to take one of these home and look at it under a microscope, where he noticed all those teeny tiny little hooks on the end. And from there was the birth of Velcro. He invented Velcro with this tiny little hook and latch mechanism. The word Velcro actually comes from the French words velour and crochet, which mean velvet and hook. So that was how he invented Velcro, and now we could see why it is such a useful little material. So here we have a vernal pond. This is one of 3 vernal ponds that we have along the Nature Access Trail, and these are really important breeding grounds for amphibians. These are actually really cool, unique bodies of water because they only occur during the spring and the fall. They're not stream fed, they're usually from seeps or just areas that are lower in the ground that fill up with water during these wet times of the year. And the reason I say that they're so important for amphibians is because they're not creek fed, they do not have fish that live in them. So therefore there's nothing eating something like those salamanders and those frogs and their eggs. So in early spring, this is where all of the salamanders and the frogs will congregate, and they'll go ahead and lay their eggs, and this provides a really important habitat for them in their early life stages. I'm currently standing in front of one of 3 deer exclosures that exist on the Latodami Nature Center property. And deer exclosures are very important to demonstrate the impact that deer browse has on Pennsylvania's forests. So as I'm sure many of you know, we have a deer overpopulation issue in this state. And the issue with deer is that they love to eat, as we all do. But when we have a lot of deer in an area, we find our forests looking like they do currently, where there's barely any undergrowth and we have limited amounts of new tree saplings, and really all that's left are those invasive non-native plants that the deer do not like to eat. So in Pennsylvania, we add some things called deer exclosures. And basically what these are just plots of land that are fenced off so that deer cannot get in. And what you can see that's really cool about deer exclosures is all of the things that grow in here that you usually won't see in Pennsylvania forests anymore due to deer browse. So inside this deer exclosure, we could see tree saplings, especially oak saplings, which are something that are not very common, sadly, anymore in this area. But you can also see some really awesome wildflowers like snow trillium, and maybe you will see some other types of salamander that need those specific habitats that aren't being provided anymore in Pennsylvania. So deer exclosures are just a really important thing to demonstrate the impact that deer do have on our environments in Pennsylvania. You may notice something about the forest behind me, and what you see here are a ton of fallen trees and debris. So us as humans, we love to keep things clean and tidy. We love our perfectly maintained lawns. And if you saw something like this on your yard, you would immediately clean it up. But in nature, messy is actually really good. Not only do these fallen logs provide awesome habitat and shelter for a lot of different creatures like deer, chipmunks, squirrels, and many other things, but they also provide a lot of nutrients to the soil. So by falling and returning and decomposing all of that material back to the soil, they can actually support growth for other new forms of life. We actually like to call fallen trees mother logs because you'll often see moss and then ferns and other types of things growing out of a fallen tree. So it's very important not only for wildlife habitat, but also to provide those nutrients back to the soil and give chance for new life to leave these sections of fallen trees along trails. We've stopped at one of my favorite locations on the Nature Access Trail, and that is this gorgeous set of benches right here. And the reason that I love it so much is this is a perfect place to practice forest bathing. So what forest bathing is basically just sitting around and bathing in the sounds and the sights of the forest. So this is the perfect place to do that. If you like to write poetry or maybe short stories, or you love to meditate, or just sit around and absorb what's going on around you, this is the perfect place to do that because you can hear the water trickling in the background. You might hear some birds flying above. We hear lots of pileated woodpeckers and nuthatches. So this is just the perfect place to soak it all in and really enjoy nature. Something you may encounter on a soggy day like today is witch's butter. So witch's butter is this really weird jelly fungus that usually grows on dead or decaying branches or logs. And it's just a very odd looking fungus. When it's dry outside, it dries up and almost looks like lichen, just a dark lichen. But as soon as it gets wet outside, the stuff inflates and it looks like jelly. And someone decided to call it witch's butter, which I think is the perfect terminology for it. So it's pretty fun to play with if you're lucky enough to come across it. As you can see, I'm currently standing in a sea of Japanese barberry. So unfortunately, this is one of the invasive plants that has begun to take over Pennsylvania's forests. So for a plant to be invasive, it has to be non-native, it has to have no natural predator, and it has to cause harm to the environment. And this Japanese barberry fills out that book entirely. So this crazy plant has these really nasty spikes all over it. It was originally brought as an ornamental plant, so you may see this in landscaping quite often. It does have a very pretty color, but sadly it harbors ticks. So not only does it outcompete all of our native vegetation, as you can see, it completely takes over this understory area right here. It's all along the hillside over here and over here. And what happens when that happens is it just completely carpets everything that's growing underneath of it and does not give a chance for something like saplings or wildflowers to grow. So instead we just end up with this giant mass of Japanese barberry. And as I said, it harbors ticks because they love to hang out on the ends of these these branches and just wait for something to come on by. So because a lot of bigger animals will not get in there to eat the ticks due to its really nasty thorns, those ticks just kind of hang out in there, and it also provides habitat for mice, which ticks love to live on top of. So if you're ever around an area with Japanese barberry, try to avoid brushing up against it, and if you do, maybe check yourself for ticks afterwards, as we're seeing that becoming a growing issue in Pennsylvania. So here we've come across one of my favorite spring wildflowers, the skunk cabbage. So this weird alien life form is actually a flower. It has this purplish color that produces a very pungent smell in the early spring. This is a very unique plant because it can actually produce its own heat. So if there is snow, it can melt that snow around it and begin to grow in the late winter and early spring. So like I said, it has that really nasty smell like rotting flesh and skunks. But we find that repulsive, but to certain pollinators, that is like perfume. So they will find this stuff and they will pollinate it. After this weird looking flower goes away, it'll have some really robust green leaves that grow out of it, but it will continue to smell like skunk if it is crushed. So if you're ever walking in a trail that has these moist wetlands or lowlands like this area, you will probably smell that and come across some really cool skunk cabbage. Even though you don't want to eat it because it smells so nasty, there are certain people that will try to eat it, but it will cause a burning and swelling sensation in your mouth. So I wouldn't suggest it. Just go ahead and leave that to the pollinators. So we'll finish up our Thursday hike on the Nature Access Trail with the wetlands that border the edge of this trail. So wetlands are a really important ecosystem for a lot of different creatures, from mammals to amphibians to waterfowl. These wetlands are important for humans too, though, because they provide some really important ecosystem services. So what wetlands can do is slow stormwater runoff, allow for silt to settle down, and then they'll actually filter out pollutants. So that is why wetlands are protected across the United States. They do a lot for the environment, and they also do a lot for humans. So if you ever come across your wetlands, just go ahead and thank them for all the services that they provide for you. Thank you so much for joining me on this virtual Thursday hike. Once regular programming resumes, we expect to see you every Thursday from 10 to 12. We meet at the basketball court parking lot off Coomer Road. So we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.